Poštovani gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. U ovom izdanju emisije analiziramo vanjskopolitičke greške Sjedinjenih Američkih Država na Bliskom Istoku. Prije svega, istražujemo kako je jedna paravojna formacija koja kontroliše polovinu Jemena uspjela poremetiti globalnu trgovinu uprkos zračnim udarima američke i britanske avijacije. Analiziramo i zbog čega Washington i dalje podržava marksističke kurdske pobunjenike u Siriji uprkos snažnom protivljenju Turske i okončanju vojnih operacija protiv ISIL-a. Također ćemo analizirati ulogu regionalnih aktera poput Turske, Izraela, Saudijske Arabije, Egipta i drugih, te kako njihovi interesi oblikuju dinamiku Mediterana i područja Crvenog mora. Prije svega, važno je razumjeti strateški položaj Bab el-Mandeba kao jednog od najbitnijih moreuza za svjetsku trgovinu. Više detalja u nastavku. Alberto Rizzi je stručnjak za ekonomiju, infrastrukturu i energetiku u Evropskom vijeću za vanjske odnose. Uključujem se iz Rima. Alberto, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us now. Allow me to begin by asking you, how do you make sense of the fact that a ragtag paramilitary unit operating on a shoestring budget, which doesn't even represent a state, turns out to be a serious adversary for the most powerful military force in the world? I'm talking about the Houthis and their attacks on cargo ships and the inability of the U.S. to stop them.
Well, the issue here is that international shipping is much more delicate and vulnerable that it might appear, and that even a small group that is armed with anti-ship missiles and drones, which also have recently become more easy to manufacture or acquire, is able to effectively block one of the most important sea lanes in the world. And the ability to target and neutralize those small launchers, it's very limited. It requires a significant amount of surveillance personnel and deployed military assets that probably goes beyond what the U.S. are willing to commit to counter what is not an essential threat to the U.S. themselves.
Right. But Alberto, just explain to our viewers how important, I mean, in strategic terms, is the Bab el-Mandeb crossing?
The Bab el-Mandeb is absolutely crucial because it's the opening route for the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, which has roughly a fifth of global cargo trade transiting through this, and is the major opening for traffic going from Asia to Europe, which are two of the most significant economic regions of the world. So any disruption affecting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is a very serious issue for global trade.
Right. Now, we very often hear that the Houthis are backed financially, militarily by Tehran. To the best of your knowledge, to what extent does Iran back the Houthis, and what are Tehran's long-term goals in having a proxy fighting force in Yemen?
Well, we know that there is a long history of relationship between Tehran and the Houthis, and that also support from Iran has helped this militia group to develop into a much more effective and capable military actor in the region. And it probably the crucial part of this support is related to Tehran's goal in the Arabian Peninsula and the ability to threaten and counter its rival Saudi Arabia, and also, as we are seeing now, to pose a strategic threat that affects the broader region. Although the important point here is that the amount of control that Tehran has over the Houthi is not as big as many have thought, and even attempts to rein them in or to constrain their willingness to launch attack. If we look at there have been talks, indirect talks through Oman between the U.S. and Iran, and it has been understood that the Tehran's ability to control them is not huge, and they enjoy a fairly good level of autonomy, which makes the whole situation more complicated.
Right. We know that the Houthis initially said that they are attacking Western-flagged ships as a way of expressing their solidarity with Israel's assault on Gaza. But then again, there were similar attacks even before the October 7th events in Israel and Palestine. So do you think even after the war, after Israel's assault on Gaza ends, will the Houthis still continue to threaten international shipping lanes passing through the Bab el-Mandeb?
But we have no guarantee that the Houthi will stop if the Gaza war ends and the ceasefire is implemented. We know that this would eliminate one of their motivations. The other one, though, is related to Yemen itself and the ongoing peace talk and the broader political settlement over the region, which is another part that has to be addressed if we want to diminish their intent in disrupting the sea route. In the end, of course, there is no guarantee that this will end, but by removing part of the motivation, we can make their interest in attacking the sea route lower. On the other hand, the point here is that they are not exclusively targeting Israeli-bound or Western ship, and they have attacked ships flagged, even Russians or Chinese flagged ships, and so even the degree of precision of their attack is not very high, which means that even supposedly innocent in their eyes, ships can still be targeted.
Right. Now, why can't the U.S. build a broad military coalition to protect freedom of navigation through the seas that, as you said, carry 20% of global container trade? I mean, the United States is principally working with the UK at targeting the Houthis, while regional allies, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, the Egyptians, they seem to be keeping their distance. I mean, I know that the Saudis and Emiratis tried to rein in the Houthis since 2015. They weren't very successful. So now is this up to the US and the UK to try and rein them in?
Well, the UK and the US have chosen the use of military force as part of the broader deterrence strategy against the Houthis. The European Union has opted for a softer approach, mainly intercepting drones and missiles and protecting ships, but without strikes over Yemen's land. And at the same time, regional actors are much more concerned about the situation and don't really want to engage in any behavior that might be considered an escalatory move or perceived in a dangerous way by other players. And also they know that they are the first in line to suffer the consequences if violence would enlarge and engulf a bigger group of countries in the region, which is a risk that, of course, the US and the UK do not run in this regard. So that makes crafting a common coalition much more difficult, and what we have now is a patchwork of different engagements without a unitary vision or objective.
Right. So is there a way for the U.S. to ensure Gulf security through partnerships or through more, policing and use of force?
Well, policing and the use of force a limitation in the fact that it merely target symptoms of the Houthis' behavior without really dealing with the causes. So in order to deal with the causes, that would require broader engagement with all the regional actors and the settling primarily of the Gaza and the Yemen war issues.
Right. And finally, in the face of Iranian expansion and, in aggression in the Gulf and beyond, has the U.S. security umbrella proved increasingly leaky in a way?
Well, yes, it's shown that it has limits in terms of its employment and its ability to deter threat. We have to keep in mind that the US are still the major security provider in the region, and that even though regional actors are exploring different partnerships on economic or energy issues, they still rely primarily on the US for security, especially if we look at Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, or Qatar. So it shows that a US security presence is still considered relevant by regional actors and is still important to ensure a certain degree of stability, but at the same time, it's not able to deal with all the emerging threat, and also there's a limit in terms of the willingness and the ability of the US to maintain this security engagement.
Right. Alberto, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Poštovani gledalci, iz Rima nam se uključio Alberto Rizzi, stručnjak za ekonomiju, infrastrukturu i energetiku u Evropskom vijeću za vanjske odnose. Odluka Obamine administracije da podrži marksističke kurdske pobuđenike u Siriji, suprotstavljajući se turskoj članici NATO-a, izazvala je mnogo rasprava i kontroverziji. Razumijevanje ovog poteza zahtjeva analizu raznih faktora, uključujući kratkoročne taktičke poteze SAD-a na Bliskom Istoku. Više detalja ima kolegica Hanan Nanić.
U 2016. godini Sjedinjene Američke države pružile su podršku kurdskim snagama u Siriji, posebno jedinicama narodne zaštite u njihovoj borbi protiv takozvane islamske države. Sjedinjene Američke države su se udružile s kurdskim snagama jer su se smatrale učinkovitima u suprotstavljanju ISIL-u na terenu. Ova vojna suradnja uključivala je pružanje oružja, obuke i zračne podrške. Međutim, Turska, saveznica SAD-a u NATO, smatrala je ove kurdske jedinice produžetkom radničke stranke Kurdistana, odnosno PKK, kurdske separatističke grupe koja je već desetljećima u sukobu s turskom vladom. Inače, turska vlada PKK smatra terorističkom organizacijom. Protivljenje Turske podršci SAD-a Kurdima u Siriji dovelo je do pogoršanja odnosa između dviju zemalja. Turska je izrazila zabrinutost zbog naoružavanja kurdskih jedinica narodne zaštite, bojeći se da će time ojačati PKK i potencijalno predstavljati prijetnju sigurnosti njenog teritorija. Ova situacija napela je odnose između SAD-a i Turske, budući da su SAD prioritetno vodile borbu protiv ISIL-a, dok je Turska prioritetno vodila brigu o vlastitim sigurnosnim pitanjima u vezi s kurdskim snagama. Pogoršanje odnosa između dviju zemalja utjecalo je na različite aspekte njihovih bilateralnih odnosa, uključujući vojnu suradnju, diplomatske interakcije i regionalnu stabilnost. Turska je tijekom vojne intervencije u Siriji 2019. godine izvela operaciju Izvor mira s ciljem suzbijanja prisutnosti kurdskih jedinica narodne zaštite duž svoje granice. Ovaj vojni potez dodatno je pogoršao odnose između Turske i SAD-a s obzirom da je Washington tada i dalje bio saveznik tih kurdskih jedinica narodne zaštite u borbi protiv ISIL-a. Spor između SAD-a i Turske oko Kurda u Siriji nije samo bilateralno pitanje, već je postalo i važna tema unutar NATO saveza. Neki članovi NATO-a podržali su SAD u njihovoj suradnji s Kurdima, dok su drugi izrazili podršku Turskoj kao savezniku. Osim vojnih i političkih implikacija, podrška SAD-a Kurdima u Siriji također je imala humanitarne posljedice. Ovaj sukob rezultirao je velikim brojem izbjeglica, razaranjem infrastrukture i patnjom civilnog stanovništva. Kroz godine situacija u Siriji i odnosi između Turske i SAD-a nastavili su se mijenjati. Međutim, pitanje položaja Kurda i njihova uloga u sirijskom sukobu i dalje ostaje važno i kompleksno pitanje s dugoročnim posljedicama za regiju.
Idemo sada do Bukurešta gdje se nalazi Nicholas Kass koji je tokom svoje karijere služio u State Departmentu, u CIA i kao direktor obavještajnih projekata u vijeću za nacionalnu sigurnost SAD-a. Nicholas, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us now. I recently read your article in the American Conservative about America's ally, the SDF, the Marxist Kurdish rebel group operating in Syria. And I was wondering, is America's relationship with this Syrian branch of the PKK emblematic of its short-sightedness in Syria?
Well, thank you very much, Harun. It's a pleasure to be on. I would say it's emblematic of our short-sightedness throughout the region and some other regions as well, because the way in which the policy was made is, I think, a pretty good example of, in which we go into the article, of some of the problems, shall we say, in American foreign policy, primarily some strategic short-sightedness in favor of the quick fix, which often turns out to be something that's harmful not only to the region, but also to the strategic interests of the United States. And it's something that the American people should understand, particularly in an election year.
Right. So as we know that, the Obama administration settled for supporting the SDF in Syria as a way of outsourcing their battle against ISIS, since there was not much support for more U.S. troops on the ground in Syria. But now that ISIS has been largely defeated, has the time come for Washington to rethink its approach towards these Marxist rebels?
Well, I'm out here in Europe listening to the debate back in Washington. And from what I could see, there's a lot of people talking past each other, perhaps some recognition of some of the challenges, or perhaps at the time is now finally ripe, although I'd say it was probably a mistake to go down this path in the first place. But I noticed that there was a lot being missed in terms of what the actual reality is of the relationship that we have. And so I wanted to clarify that. And I hope that that has some positive effect, because I think people generally try to elide or ignore the fact that the SDF is in fact the Syrian branch of the PKK, as had been identified by U.S. intelligence in open testimony, but people sort of would take that data point and just move on and kind of forget about it. So I think it's important for them to understand, because it has the continuation of this relationship has come at a cost to American governance as well. It's a smaller situation, let's say, than the Iraq War or the Afghan War, but it involved the same kind of subterfuge and misinformation. And for a government that's really key now on preventing misinformation, the first thing they should look at it is in the mirror, I think. And this is a good example of that problem.
Right. So, but what do you argue that U.S. support for the SDF in Syria is perpetuating instability in the region?
Yes. Well, it does so on several different grounds. One, and you can see this currently in the debate right now, it's often identified in the United States as the representative of the Kurds, or writ large. And of course, it treats the Kurds as if it was some sort of monolith of a group that was marching toward the progressive future that everybody seems to be talking about in Washington these days. Obviously, it's a very, very complex society. The PKK in Syria has actually crushed opposition from other Kurdish groups, particularly peaceful ones. It threatens the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq, which is a legally constituted body. And it threatens this by trying to expand its influence and power into the area. And of course, it creates a great deal of problems with Turkey, because for many years, the PKK has been seen as Turkey's primary security threat, and American support for that cannot fail but to be seen as a sign of strategic hostility, which has had emanations in a variety of different areas, not only in terms of Turkey's willingness to consider improved relations with Russia, but also with respect to, let's say, the Eastern Mediterranean, with the rest of the Middle East, and in the Aegean Sea, where I think in part Turkish assertiveness is a reflection not only of what they see coming from the United States, but also an effort to demonstrate that there are costs to this American approach. And,
right, but all this that you just said, I mean, does anybody in Washington understand this, that this this frustration between Ankara and Washington, D.C. predates the purchase of the S-400 system.
Yes, I think probably part of the problem was that there's not a lot of sympathy for Turkey, particularly under Mr. Erdogan, because he did not fall into the expected line in the aftermath of his consolidation of power. As you know, it was a process in Turkey. It took many, many years. It wasn't when he came into power. He had to face a lot of coups and coup attempts and threats, including the 2016 coup, for example, the violent one. And so he has not been the, let's say, the favored child of elite Washington, particularly in Washington, where the establishment view is a much more neoliberal view than perhaps in previous eras. So I think that's been the big problem. That means less focus on the importance of Turkey as a strategic ally. And we're seeing once that policy changes, we see it starts to consolidate in the bureaucracy, and then inertia takes over. And we're seeing the fruits of that today, obviously, with the very, very poor relationship with the United States. There's been some efforts recently to try to repair that, but I think that the Turks remember when candidate Joe Biden said that he wanted to overthrow Erdogan,
Right.
not through a coup, of course, but Turkey, they've had a lot of experiences through coups that were designed to look like democratic processes. The 28 Şubat coup in 1997, for example,
Right,
which
right.
is a prime example. So these distinctions do not register very well with Turkish politicians, I do not believe.
Right. Yes. Speaking of relations warming between the two allies, we have seen the approved sale of this batch of F-16s and the modernization kits being approved by the Congress. But do you still sense lurking mistrust within the halls of the State Department, the intelligence circles in Washington, D.C. towards Turkey? I was wondering, do they realize the importance of Turkey as a Western ally, as a NATO ally, a country that borders Iraq, Iran, Russia in a way, the Caucasus, the Balkans?
Well, I would say, just speaking generally, that there are many people in Washington who understand these things. Many of those people who understand that, yet do not understand the intricacies of Turkish political and social development, and so they get easily hived off when things look bad. I think the biggest problem is not what Turkey is doing. I think Turkey is often very, very clear about what it's doing, particularly with respect to the PKK. They don't sugarcoat it. They don't use misdirection. The problem is, I think, a problem of the Washington foreign policy hive being able to think outside the box and understanding, first and foremost, that ground truth, the realities on the ground are the most important thing. You can oppose a policy or an ideological view of the world with greater or lesser success, but you have to have some reference and understanding about what's actually happening on the ground. And I think that's often elided over, particularly in the case of SDF when it comes to the situation. So it's a pathology that I think has been very present in American foreign policy throughout the 21st century in particular. And we've seen some of the results of that. And this is another example of that, I think.
Right. Nicholas, I really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Poštovani gledalci, iz Bukurešta nam se uključio Nicholas Kass, koji je tokom svoje karijere služio u State Departmentu, u CIA i kao direktor obavještajnih projekata u Vijeću za nacionalnu sigurnost SAD-a. Dok je postignut opipljiv trijumf u eliminaciji prijetnje ISIL-a, nastavak saradnje SAD-a i kurdskih pobunjenika u Siriji bi mogao rezultirati dugoročnim posljedicama koji su suprotne ciljevima SAD-a, uključujući konsolidaciju moći PKK te produbljivanje napetosti sa vitalnim partnerom unutar NATO-a, Turskom. Stoga, ključno je za američke strateške planere da pažljivo promišljaju alternative koje bi omogućile usklađivanje svojih sa interesima saveznika. Poštovani gledaoci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našem web portalu balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.